Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and giving up this beautiful afternoon at the end of our term to come and join us today. I'm very excited to have you here. My name is Cinnamon Moffett. I'm the Research Program Manager here at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, and this is our seminar for today. This is a hybrid event, so we have folks online and folks in the room. For folks online, if you haven't been with us before, we do have your cameras, mics, and screen shares disabled. So please put any questions you might have that are technical issues or questions for today's speaker into the chat box, and we'll work through those together at the end of today's presentation. Our volunteer, Roseanne, is in the room, and she will help us navigate those questions. For folks in the room, I'm looking around, you all done this with me before, but if you have a question for today's speaker, just raise your hand and I'll bring a mic to you. That way folks online can hear your question and our presenter can hear your question as well. But again, thank you so much for being here for today's talk. Wanted to do a couple of quick announcements. Wanted to promote next week's seminar, which is June 13th. Scott Huppel, who is a professor with the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University, will be talking about decadal changes of abundance in fishes and invertebrates right here in Yaquina Bay. So that's been a long study that he's been working on, and he's going to share the results that were just published recently. So excited to have Scott presenting next week. I also wanted to present, we've got a kind of an unusual event that's happening. It's a lunch and learn. So on June 17th at noon in the library seminar room, we have a speaker, Valentine Punatsa. I'm sure I'm messing up that last name, so forgive me if you're online, from the Paris Institute of Planetary Physics, who will be talking about exploring the largest submarine explosion on Earth, a trip to the Indian Ocean. So that one is not on everyone's schedule, but I'm hoping that you can join us for a lunch and learn on June 17th. And then I'm just going to do a little promo of our Markham Symposium this year, which will be the following week on June 20th from 2 to 5. We will not have a seminar that day, but Markham Symposium is a chance for us to celebrate our students. There will be a keynote speaker from Brittany Skorskoff, who is a research fisheries biologist and an ex-HMSC student. She is currently now at NOAA's Southwest Fisheries Science Center. Will be coming back to give us a talk. We also will have a student poster session and student and night talks. So it's a really great day to learn about what our students are doing. So those are some of our events. If you are curious about those events and you want to learn more about how to join us, if you go to the HMSC homepage, scroll to the bottom, there's an event calendar there and you can get all the details you need. But with all of that, I wanted to introduce today's speaker, Molly Keogh. Keogh, I'm learning how to say names today, is a NSF postdoc with the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. She has an undergrad degree in geologic sciences from the University of Oregon and a PhD from Tulane University. After returning to Oregon, Molly completed her postdoc at the University of Oregon, working largely at OIMB and the South Slough National Estuary Reserve, and started her current postdoc position at OSU last fall. Her research focuses on coastal sediment dynamics, wetlands, and land change, and we're really excited to have you here today and share with us. So I'm going to hand the mic to you. Why don't you go green? And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cinnamon. Is this working? Yeah, okay. I can't hear it, but thank you. Okay. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about really the beginning of my postdoc work. So spoiler alert for right now, come back in 2 years and I'll tell you how it turns out. But let me get my pointer going. I like to point. So I'm going to be talking about polar sediments on the move, and particularly if lead-210 is a useful sediment tracer at high latitudes. So like Cinnamon said, I'm a postdoc over at the main campus in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. And I'm just getting going on this work, and I'm really excited to share it with you. My background is working in temperate wetlands and coastal environments. So with this postdoc, I'm moving north and south into the polar regions. So this is an adventure for me. Let's see. Okay, so 3 questions are going to guide me as I talk you through this talk. First off, thinking about polar sediments. Where's the sediment going? How do we measure it? And why do we care? And I'm actually going to go in reverse order here. So starting with why do we care? So this is a photograph from northern Alaska, which has the fastest coastal erosion rates in the world. Something like in some areas up to 10 meters per year of lateral erosion, which is pretty shocking. So there's a lot of change going on, and this cabin is done for. And this is driven by some changes that are happening particularly rapidly in the polar regions. And the Arctic in particular is warming 4 times faster than the global average. So you can see here these kind of light colored lines. This is through time, the temperature anomaly. We're warming across the globe, but in the Arctic region, these are observations. We're warming much faster. And these images down here show the trend in temperature. So changes in degrees Celsius per decade, and the amplification that's calculated from that. So big red dots. Interestingly, this is happening in the Arctic at 4 times faster. That's not the case for the Antarctic. And that goes into a world that I don't know about. But so this amplification is particularly a problem in the Arctic. As a result, permafrost is melting. This map here shows carbon-rich soils that are thawing and releasing their carbon to the atmosphere. When I first looked at this, I thought the red areas are thawing, but the blue areas are not. That's not true. If you read the fine print, it's all thawing, and the red is rapid, and the blue is more gradual. So there's a lot of thawing going on here. And at the same time, the sea ice, the days of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean are shortening. So fewer days, the shoreline is protected by sea ice. So here we have the last couple of decades and the number of open water days per year. And you can see the average increase in days per year, it's just less than 2 days per year more open water. So as a result, I think this is a really fascinating series of photographs. This spans about 36 days. So when they first put up a camera, there's still sea ice in the water. And then the first open water day happened maybe a couple of weeks later. And then through time, you see this coastal bluff start to erode. And after just over a month, the camera tips over because that bluff fell over. So this is very rapid. As a result of all of this, more sediment is entering the coastal ocean. So actually, in this case, most of the sediment in the Arctic is sourced from these coastal bluffs and the erosion. Additionally, some sediment comes down the rivers and enters the ocean at deltas. So a couple of sources. So stepping back again, why does this matter? We're changing the amount of sediment that's arriving in the coastal ocean, but why do we care? First off, coastal land change. Not a ton of folks live. It's not like we have megacities in these Arctic coastlines, but still, there's really valuable land and communities there that are experiencing really devastating change. Nutrient fluxes. A lot of nutrients tied up in these permafrost soils that are entering the coast, and that fuels changes in primary productivity in the coastal ocean. And finally, carbon sequestration. So these permafrost soils are melting and releasing carbon dioxide, but also there's an interesting combination with these sediments that are moving and going somewhere. That's the next part. Where are they going? And sequestering carbon somewhere in the coastal ocean, perhaps. Okay, so with those questions in mind, let's think about how we measure sediment accretion. So these sediments are on the move. Where are they going, and how are we going to measure them? This image these are X-radiographs of a set of sediment cores. So sediment cores are my bread and butter. Yeah, that's my bread and butter. But with them, we are going to be looking at radioisotopes. So there are 3 primary radioisotopes that I use to date sediments on human timescales. And most of my work is looking at human timescales over the last 100, maybe 150 years. So beryllium-7, lead-210, and cesium-137. And they each have a different history. Beryllium-7 has a really short half-life of 53 days. Lead-210 is more like 22 years. Cesium is 30 years. They each have a different history of naturally occurring or anthropogenic. But today I want to focus on lead-210, which has a dating limit of about 120 years. And it is formed through the uranium-238 decay series. So it's naturally occurring in rocks globally. So it's produced through this decay series, and it passes through radon gas. Which is some radon gas stays in the soil. It's trapped in the soil or the rock, but some escapes to the atmosphere. So we have these kind of diverging pathways of where the radon gas goes. And if you've ever heard about people being worried about radioactivity in their basements, their limestone basements, or their brick houses, this is radon gas, which accumulates as it's decaying out of the uranium-238 series and is trapped in these spaces. So air out your basements, or else you'll end up with extra lead-210 in there. So it passes through radon gas, and the radon gas that stays trapped in the soil becomes what is called supported lead-210, and that's what's produced in situ. The radon gas that escapes to the atmosphere still decays into lead-210, and then it falls back out with both wet and dry deposition. And that's termed excess lead-210. And that's actually the part that we're interested in. In general, the supported lead-210 that's produced in place, it's kind of a steady, constant background rate of production. The excess lead is the interesting part. So as lead reaches as it falls out of the atmosphere, it likes to adhere particularly to mud-sized particles. So clay minerals are its favorite thing to latch onto because they're sheet silicates. And you can see in this diagram, these sheet silicates have charges on the edges. They're broken sheets, and they have these charges that just stick ions onto them. So lead-210 loves to stick to clay-sized particles. And then once it's on there, it travels with this clay. So I heard someone recently describe it as an air tag. So you stick your air tag onto the sediment, and you follow it wherever it goes. So that's what we're doing with lead-210. If we take a look at this in an idealized sedimentary environment, we have here the uranium decaying through a few intermediate daughter products, and we've got some radon gas escaping to the atmosphere. We've got some getting stuck in the sediment. And in both cases, it works its way perhaps into the water column, raining down, and travels with the sediment and then is deposited and in a location where we then take a sediment core. This is a very, very idealized profile of what the activity of lead-210 might look like with depth. So pretend this is our sediment core. And at the top, we have a lot of lead-210 activity, and then it decays with depth back to this kind of steady background rate. And this is the supported lead-210 that's produced in place. But what we're really interested in is this decay curve at the top. And that gives us the ability to calculate a sedimentation rate. So here's an example of real data from Antarctica. And this is a beautiful decay profile where now it's this paper plotted it in log linear space. So this is now, the decay curve is now a straight line, but it's a very nice straight line down to a nice background. And these authors calculated about a 3 millimeter per year accretion rate in this area on the West Antarctic Peninsula. So Antarctica, we have success with lead-210. Let's look at the Arctic. So again, we're looking at the excess lead-210 with depth in a sediment core, and we're looking for something that looks like a decay curve, and it's not there. We have this kind of messy profile with big error bars, no clear pattern with depth. It's not working. And this is actually a pattern that we see commonly across the Arctic, is that lead-210, which is one of our most reliable sediment tracers at temperate latitudes and tropical latitudes, doesn't always work in the Arctic, and we don't really know why. So At the same time, it's working well in the Antarctic. And in some areas, we have good enough resolution of lead-210 that we can see recent increases in sediment accretion rate. So again, these are really fantastic profiles that this is what researchers would love to see. So here I want you to focus on the black lines, forget about all the red. And so for example, in this plot, we can see, so this is depth in the sediment core, which is essentially time. And here's a steeper rate followed back in time by a slower rate. So they're calculating that recent sediments have been accreting at about 5.5 millimeters per year. Before that, it was about 2 millimeters per year. And we see this change across all 4 of these profiles. So what we're seeing is that accretion is about 2.5 times greater today in this area than it was, approximately 35 years ago, which is an interesting change. And there's a lot of questions to ask about why. Okay, so part 3, where is the sediment going? And this is going to be the meat of the work that I'm doing, and I don't have all of the answers yet. So this image here, and this was at the top of my talk as well, this is the Mackenzie River Delta on the Beaufort Sea, which the Beaufort Sea stretches the northern coast of Alaska and Canada. And this Landsat image, you can see all of the sediment that's coming off of the land and into the coastal ocean. And it's swirling around with wind and currents. And eventually, it's going to either be transported out of the area or it's going to be deposited. And we want to know where it's going. So a recent paper did a global synthesis of sediment accretion rates using one of these other isotopes, cesium-137, which is a fantastic study. Look at all those dots of successful use of cesium-137 across these areas. And as a part of this, they mentioned if these studies also used lead-210. So kind of as an afterthought, they included that. But where's Antarctica? It's not even on this map, which says to me that there's not a lot of successful cesium-137 studies in the Antarctic. And so they're not looking for lead-210 studies either. So this is a big gap in what we know about these isotopes in the polar regions. So I started with that study with their analysis, and I just looked at the polar regions. So here we have what they found, their literature search of successful lead-210 studies in the Arctic. And there are some dots, which is great. So this is a starting place for me. But most of these dots are concentrated around, this area over here of Northern Europe and a little bit into Russia and some over here in Alaska. But there's a big stretch of Siberia in the Canadian archipelago that they didn't have any data for. And again, lead-210 was kind of an afterthought for this synthesis paper. If you look at Antarctica, there's exactly 1 dot on the map. They found 1 successful study using lead-210. Okay, so starting with that, I thought, I wonder if there's more. So I searched the literature and I found Arctic papers and I found Antarctic papers. And one thing that's interesting to note about this is, I don't have the dates on here, but this is a 2014 paper. I think this is 1994. And this is the same, they're looking at the same region, the Simpson Lagoon, Colville Delta, Simpson Lagoon. So sometimes not only are we looking for spatial distribution of studies and their synthesis of lead-210 and sediment accretion rates, but also through time. So these 2 papers are looking at the same place 30 years apart. So I'll come back to that. So I'm currently working on a synthesis of more literature, and I've added many more dots to the map. So we've got a bunch here throughout Canada and Alaska and Greenland. Still a big gap over here in Russia, which is tricky. That'll be a tricky area to fill in. Not a lot of American researchers doing coring in coastal Russia these days. but wish me luck there. Antarctica, again, is data sparse. There are these two areas on the West Antarctic Peninsula and the Ross Sea that have lots of data, which is wonderful, and very little existing data in more distant areas. So I'm going to take it upon myself to, oh, hold that thought. I want to go back to this place in Simpson Lagoon and thinking about what has changed. So this is one of the most valuable things about searching the literature, is that there's this rich history of lead-210 studies, and we can think about what maybe has changed through time, not just spatially, but through time. So this is a paper, again, it's from 1984. And so here's at Alaska. This is near the Colville River Delta in northern Alaska. This is Simpson Lagoon. So you've got a fairly good-sized river coming in here with lots of distributary channels feeding sediment to the coastal ocean. And then there's a series of barrier islands here, which trap some of that sediment in. So it provides a good sheltered area, which is a good sediment sink. And there's a pretty good sediment record there. Okay, so in this paper, they found up to about 0.5 centimeter per year of sediment accretion. 30 years later, another set of researchers collected sediment cores, analyzed lead-210 in the same area. Again, here's the edge of the Colville River Delta and these barrier islands. And they found a minimum of about 0.5 centimeter per year, up to about 1.5 centimeters. So I'm curious about this. Has sediment accretion in this area really doubled or tripled? That's something similar to what some of those other papers we're seeing in the Antarctic. Is this truly a change in sediment accretion rate? Or are there differences in the methods that these papers are using, or small scale spatial differences? Their cores weren't collected in exactly the same places, but the same region. So this is the kind of thing that I want to explore farther and answer some of those questions. Okay, so in order to fill in the spatial gaps and the time gaps, I'm taking advantage of OSU's Marine and Geology repository, which is a really cool resource that's over on the main campus, and is the reason that I'm doing this postdoc at OSU. This is a map of the sediment cores that they have housed in their warehouse. So it's over 6,000 Antarctic cores and 6,000 Arctic cores and 7,000 Antarctic cores. And you can see dots all over the place on that map. Here's the photograph from the inside. All of these tubes are housing sediment cores that have been cut in half and very carefully archived. It's a really great resource. So this is an example of one of the cores, and here's one of the undergrad students that I'm working with, helping me out taking subsamples. So these are all cores that were collected for other science, and then NSF housed them for people like me to come back and collect new data on these cores so that I don't have to go out and collect new cores. Thank you, everybody, for doing this good work. Okay, so out of those zillions of thousands of cores that the repository is housing, there are a few requirements for them to be useful to me to this work. First, they have to have a coring method that preserves the surface interval. So often these cores are collected in deep water with a big coring core that when it hits the seafloor, it blows away the surface sediment. And that's where all the lead-210 is and all the recent sediments. So we don't actually have 6,000 or 7,000 cores available to us, but several hundred. So here in the yellow dots are MGR cores that we are available us for subsampling. And so it really fills in kind of this interior section of the Arctic Ocean basin, which is exciting, new geographic area. And the question, of course, is, will this lead-210 analysis be successful in any of these cores? Because again, we found that lead-210 is successful in some areas, but not in others. And that's one of the looming questions, is why is it successful? And are there things that researchers can do to either choose locations, specific settings that are more likely to have lead-210 in successful analyses, and are there analysis methods that are more likely to be successful. And I could dive into that, but I think I won't have time. Okay, so now let's look at Antarctica. Similar situation. These are the cores that are available. And again, there's a lot of them concentrated around the West Antarctic Peninsula and the Ross Sea and some areas, other areas as well. Interestingly, some of these cores out here in on this side of Antarctica, that I guess you call that the east side, get mixed up in down there. Some of these are pretty old, and lead-210 again has a half-life of 22 years. So some of these, and so we can, and some of these activities of lead-210 are pretty low to start with, and they're decaying through time. So some of these cores were collected 30, 40 years ago. So we've already gone through 1 or 2 half-lives, and in not too long, those radioisotopes will decay below the detection limit. So another sort of side benefit of this project, or goal of this project, is to preserve some of these radioisotopes before they're not detectable anymore. Okay, so let's look at some of the accretion rates. And this is the part that I'm just now diving into. So looking in the Arctic, these are all accretion rates, the orange dots, so ranging from, down to negligible, less than a quarter of a centimeter per year, to a few places with as much as 1 or more centimeters per year. That's relatively uncommon. But of the studies that I found so far, the mean is about 3 millimeters per year of sediment. And these highest accretion rates tend to be in fjords, that are deep water environments that are not subject to ice scour processes or wave action that reaches the bottom and resuspends sediment. Also in deltas where there's some additional sediment input and sometimes these barrier islands that protect sediment from reworking. In the Antarctic, the mean sediment accretion rate from the cores that we've found so far, slightly higher, 4 millimeters a year. Here we also find highest rates in fjords and in near shore areas. So it's going to be interesting to dive into this and look more at how do accretion rates vary with environments and water depths, distance from sediment sources. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. Okay, I'm powering through this. So I'm already at next steps and goals. So I've been talking up to this point about sediment accretion rates and where is the sediment going. But stepping back, the way we measure lead-210 is through its activity. And some of the reasons why lead-210 studies are not successful in the Arctic in particular is because the activity is too low. So my next step is to map the activity itself. What areas have enough activity to measure it, to get a sediment accretion rate, and what areas do not. And again, that will help guide some researchers as they are looking to get sediment accretion information. Is this a useful tool in the area that they want to study? So creating maps and sort of guidelines for folks about where lead-210 is useful, and pairing this with locations where cesium-137, which I only touched on a little bit, is useful and or not useful. And then thinking about analysis methods, which I mentioned just briefly, there are 2 main methods of measuring the activity of lead-210. It decays through 2 different pathways, gamma decay and alpha decay. And gamma is measuring the gamma decay is a pretty easy laboratory process, but it has greater uncertainty. So at the work that I'm doing at OSU with the course from the repository, I'll be doing analysis of alpha decay, which is a much more involved chemistry process, which is trickier, more time consuming, but has much smaller error bars, which, so hopefully we can get some good data out of that in places where folks weren't able to use gamma analysis. Okay, additionally, I want to compare environments. So what's going on in fjords versus the open continental shelf versus coastal lakes with these different water depths, with these different water circulation rates? How does that affect the residence time of lead 210? And with that information, I can identify some baseline conditions. And again, we're already seeing a lot of change in the Arctic, but establishing baseline conditions now will help us understand the change moving forward. And again, I mentioned this, but preserving some short-lived radioisotope data before it decays beyond detection limit. So these are some pretty ambitious goals. Again, please check back in about 2 years, and I should have some more to share with you. That's all I have today, so I'm happy to take some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions online? Okay, if anybody is online and has a question for Molly, please put it in the chat and we can work through that. How about questions in the room? All right, we'll work through those. Hang on, everyone.
Cool talk. I had a question about the gear. You said there was a difference in the coring gear. Like sometimes it blows the useful part off. Could you go into a little bit more about that? Because I don't know much about coring stuff.
I will do my best with the caveat that I'm very much a land-based sedimentologist. And so these are mostly marine-based oceanographers dropping corers off of ships, which I've never done before. But my understanding is that some of the corers are very big and heavy, and they're dropping through thousands of feet of water. And they get up a velocity that when they hit the seafloor, you can just imagine this relatively low density sediment on the seafloor just and so the top, who knows, 10, 20 centimeters might be just washed away. And there's some other cores that are that go down to the seafloor more slowly, somehow more gently, and I can't tell you any more about that. But there are certain core types that more successfully preserve the surface interval. And again, these in the repository, these cores were all collected by other researchers with their own purposes. And some people care about the surface interval and chose cores and were careful to preserve that. And for other studies, it didn't matter, and so they don't have that.
Yeah, a couple more questions in the room. Hang on.
Thanks for the talk, Molly. It looked like you had a bunch of samples, these new cores that are somewhat co-located with some of the old data. And I'm curious how closely located they need to be for you to then have like temporal variation within the same area.
That's a really great question. And I hope I'll find out the answer. So yeah, so maybe you're thinking about right in this kind of area where there's right around the coast of Alaska with a lot of these existing studies and a lot of yellow dots, of course, that I could analyze. And also this paired study that I mentioned where these cores are, what's the scale bar on this? 10 kilometers. So in terms of the Arctic Ocean, this is a pretty small study area. These cores are pretty close together, but there's a pretty big variation in accretion rates even in this small area. So hard to say. I'm curious if this kind of, I mean, this looks like it's a doubling to tripling of the sediment accretion rate, which to me seems larger than I would expect just with natural variability, spatial variability. The highest accretion rates that this 1984 paper found were the lowest accretion rates that the 2014 paper found. That said, there's a lot of shoaling, there's a lot of shifting, there's barrier islands here. If the barrier islands roll over, you could see what appears to be a huge spike in sedimentation rate, but it's really this sort of natural process of barrier islands migrating. So I'll be curious to see if we see this sort of change in sedimentation rate in other areas. And who knows, this 2014 paper, we already have another 10 years of data. So maybe there'll be another set of cores recently collected in the Simpson Lagoon there. So yeah, I'm hoping to find some other paired areas like that.
Molly, can you just answer, what is the applied application of some of this research that you're working on?
Applied application. I think one of the major questions here is about carbon sequestration. And are these areas successful carbon sinks? A lot of our research into carbon budgets focuses on terrestrial environments or deep ocean. So just finding out how much of what part of the budget are these coastal sediments, and what is the balance between the amount of sediment that's being released and at the coastlines versus what's being sequestered in the coastal ocean.
Thank you. A couple more questions.
Yeah, great talk. I was wondering if you had like a hypothesis on how water depth or like distance out to sea would affect the sedimentation rate, because it seems like so much of the existing literature is clustered around in the coastal areas, but you have access to these deep water cores.
Yeah, great question. So there's kind of a, in terms of water depth, there's kind of an interesting pattern. So the shallowest, because the Arctic in particular is so affected by ice processes. We don't have to worry about that here. So in the shallowest lagoons that are, 2 meters, real shallow, the sea ice freezes to the bottom, and those sediments are protected from winter waves and currents. So close to shore, you can get pretty good sedimentation rates because every winter it's protected. The deep ocean, off the on the continental slope or even the deeper shelf, also you get below wave base, and so those sediments aren't as reworked by waves or ice processes. In the interim, though, in between it, maybe, I don't know, 10, 20, maybe 30 meters of water depth, you get a lot of scour from ice. There's a whole host of processes where two types of ice sheets can come together and they kind of crinkle up so that they have these really deep keels that just tear up the seafloor and make measurements of anything going on the seafloor tricky. So that's what we expect to see with water depth is better preservation at the shallow and the deep end, poor preservation in kind of the middle water depths. In terms of water environments like fjords that have deep old water in them versus open coastal oceans with circulation, because a lot of the lead-210 is coming from the atmosphere, the activity of lead-210 has to do with how recently the water has interacted with the atmosphere. And I don't know yet what we'll find there, except that perhaps some of these environments with less circulation have lower lead-210 activity because it hasn't interacted with the atmosphere recently.
All right, another question in the room.
So you had this whole slide about airdrops, and that lead-210 that gets, goes with the radon and then settles out onto those clay particles and then eventually makes its way into the sedimentation. Do you think, and it seemed like it was, it wasn't, you dropped it in there, but there wasn't a whole lot more talk about it, right? And so I guess I'm wondering, are you thinking that there may be an increase in the amount of that sort of thing that might be like, you had some areas that you showed some slides where, gee, this just isn't working. Is it maybe variation in the airdrop lead 210, or would you expect that there might be an increase in the airdrop lead 210 over time as, there's more, gases that are being released?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So there's a parallel field of work looking at atmospheric scientists and how lead-210 and other radioisotopes move through the atmosphere and the different distributions with latitude. And from what I understand of that work is that it is known that lead-210 is generally less, there's less of it at high latitudes, both north and south. Don't necessarily understand why something with atmospheric circulation. So already at the poles, there's less lead-210 in the atmosphere to fall out. Now, if that's going to change with the amount entering the atmosphere is going to change, I'm not sure. In any case, once it falls out of the atmosphere, it's what it's interacting with once it reaches the water or the land that I'm kind of interested. So say it falls out of the atmosphere and hits sea ice. It's going to move. It's going to be deposited, stuck on the top of the sea ice, move with the sea ice until that sea ice melts. Versus if there's no sea ice, it'll enter the ocean immediately and travel with the currents there. So those are two different pathways, and that's something that's likely to be changing. Yeah, does that answer your question?
It gives me your thoughts on it, and basically that's what I was asking for. So
Okay,
yes.
yeah, so I don't know how the atmospheric part may change. So what I'm going to be looking at is however much is up there, once it reaches the surface, where is it going?
All right. Any other questions in the room? All right, hang on just a second. For folks online, you don't see me running up and down the steps, but that's what I'm doing.
Thank you. You answered half my question. You mentioned scouring. I thought that could affect your results in terms of interpretation of your data. What about also bioturbation? There's animals living in these sediments, and they turbate. They mix these sediments around too. So that could be problematic in your interpretation as well.
Yeah.
Or comment on it. Have you been thinking about that and how it might affect your results?
Yes, absolutely. Bioturbation, yeah, is very common and can be problematic. Often in these idealized profiles, there's a decay profile, the background. Often they also include a mixed layer at the surface where it's all mixed up and we just it's sort of a vertical activity is the same in that section, and it's on the orders of 10, maybe 20 centimeters. And then below that, you'll see a decay profile. Again, that's ideal. In some of these particularly Arctic regions where sedimentation rate is very low, you already have not a lot of new material coming in, and then you get bioturbation and dilution of the small signal that's there already, and you can have nothing left. So biology is a real problem for geology.
For folks online, that was vice versa too. All right, any other last questions? All right, can we give one more round of applause for our speaker today? And Molly, we expect to have you back in 2 years. We'll get a final kind of round up on all the things that you've been working on.
Sounds good. I'll be excited to do that.
All right. Thank you everyone for being here. We hope to see you next week. Thanks everyone online. Bye now.